So how does a 100 plus megapixel digital Fuji camera compare to 4x5 color negative material? We're gonna find out today. So my friend Don was kind enough to let me borrow his Fuji GFX S2 102 megapixel camera with a 55 f1.7 lens. Absolutely brilliant combination. And I decided to challenge that camera with Ektar 100 in 4x5. So I broke out my LInhof 4x5 camera, which I love, I've had it forever, and put on what I consider one of my best 4x5 lenses, which is a Rodenstock 135 APO. And I set up for my standard, really difficult test scene to see just how good, that modern digital 102 megapixel sensor is when compared with large format film. So what we're going to be looking for in this test is a couple of things. We're looking for overall sharpness from top to bottom. We're looking at overall dynamic range. We're looking for how clean the shadows and highlights are, how accurate the color reproduction is, and just which one feels better. Which one feels better to our eye. So let's head out to the studio and let's process some film. Okay, so we're in the studio now. I've got the Jobo up to temp. Once again, C41, we're processing Ektar 100 4x5. I've already been working on the Fuji file. It's quite amazing. Today I'm going to be using my expert drums for processing the 4x5. I've had these literally since 1993. Cleanest, best way I've ever found for processing 4x5. So let's load up the film and we'll take a look at the negatives. Thought I would share a fun fact on how you get the lid off the tank. The tank on the expert drums is really difficult to get off. What you have to use is a foot pump, and the pressure causes the lid to pop. It's super cool. All right, so the first image we're gonna look at is made by the Fuji, and as you can see, it is absolutely beautiful. To my eye, it has wonderful color, it has wonderful clarity. The dynamic range from shadows to highlight is huge, absolutely huge. Clarity is very good, and an ISO 80, noise and everything is kept to an absolute minimum. Now, of course, you could work this file up in raw software a million different ways. Different color palettes, all sorts of options are available to you. I chose to bring this into Photoshop using the color space Russell RGB. It's similar to Beta RGB. I think that those are two really good ICC profile spaces to be working in, especially when you've got images that have so much information. I use Beta RGB or Russell RGB a lot, also when I'm doing scanning on the Imacon. So overall, first impressions, looks absolutely amazing. Let's take a look at the Ektar in 4x5. Once again, wow. Color is beautiful. The dimensional quality that you're seeing of that big piece of film is absolutely gorgeous. Once again, also shadow to highlight range is huge, absolutely huge. Again, this was scanned on an Imacon 646, and I brought it into Photoshop in Beta RGB. And both the files, I should mention, have been mashed in terms of resolution. So the Fuji at full res works at the 102 megapixel, works out to about 560, 80, somewhere in there megabytes. And I did the same thing for the Imacon. It was scanned to equal that same amount of resolution. So if you look at the two images side by side, they both look amazing. Any difference in color balance is just how I made it in Photoshop. And I also do think that the video editing software that I'm using is compressing the color a fair amount, because the Ektar image was definitely bolder than what I'm seeing, and the Fuji image had not shifted quite as warm. But you get the general idea. When you see the two, shadow to highlight range, overall tonality is amazing on the two cameras. So now when we zoom in on a detailed area, what I'm seeing is a lot of similarities between the two. The Fuji looks absolutely amazing. The Ektar film looks absolutely amazing. They both have incredibly good micro detail. And if you look into the deep shadow areas to the highlights, they both have, once again, that huge dynamic range that's so important on a scene like this. So now that we've zoomed in even more, what I notice
is that the Kodak has a little bit more nuance in terms of tonality and color in the wood. And I also feel a little more pop, and which of course you could tweak easily in the Fuji file and bring those shadows down a little bit more. I also notice a little bit more of a textural feel of the wood in the Ektar image. However, that would be very easy to bring up in the Fuji file with just a little bit of additional structure. And when I look at that really bright license plate there, the one that's really bright in the sun, the white one, on the Fuji, there's a lot of contrast in it. There's really no detail on that white. It's completely blown out. When I look at, but yet the black has a little bit of pop. When I look at the Kodak one, I can read the numbers, and if I wanted to go in and burn it, I absolutely could. But what's interesting is in the film one, the word Vermont underneath the numbers is barely legible. So the film was holding that extreme highlight value just a little better, but it's really impressive that both of them held anything at all. Now, in this view here, what's really interesting is I photographed the 4x5 at f32. Big piece of film, you need to stop it down in order to have adequate depth of field. We chose f8.5 for the Fuji, knowing that that would be a really sharp f-stop for that particular camera. And if you look at it, the building there on the left on both are really good. I think the film one just really pops. The highlights are just really clear. And when I look into the background, of course, you have that interesting extra depth of field there. I'm looking at the shadow detail way in the background. It's both really nice. The texture of the paint is really beautiful. I do think the film has a small advantage, but once again, I think that would be something that with a little more structure or something you could bring out in the Fuji camera. But I'm, once again, super impressed. Okay, so I decided to do an ultra high resolution scan of just a small portion of the Ektar negative. Now, what's interesting about this is that unless you own a scanner like an Imacon, a Tango, an Aztec Premier, something like that, this is not possible. Most of your Epson scanners, say your V750 Pro, 850, they max out at 2400 in terms of scanner resolution. Anything beyond that number, yes, I know Epson gives you more options, but anything beyond that number really is interpolation, and you also start losing quality just very quickly. If you don't believe me, run a test yourself. You'll find that 2400 is the upper threshold. And I even think a little bit less than 2400 is really the sweet spot, maybe like 2200, somewhere in there. So what I did is on the Imacon, I have the option of going up to literally 6300 DPI. I usually stop somewhere around the mid 5000s. I think that optically that's about as good as it is. And what I would do is scan the negative in sections and then stitch the file together. Now, as you can imagine, this would take hours of work. But at the same time, I would get a scan that isn't 600 megabytes, that would be closer to 3 gigabytes. So it is a massive scan, and that's what you're looking at. And remember I said if you look at the white license plate, you could see the word C Vermont under it. If we zoom in, yes, it is absolutely there. So that shows you just how big the dynamic range is of this particular film. However, are we really getting more detail at this much higher resolution? And what I would say is probably not. There does come a point on film where the higher resolution isn't really extracting more detail per se, it's just extracting and making a larger file. So determining what that max needed threshold for resolution for yourself is really important, and it's based upon a couple of factors. What size film are you working with? Is it color, black and white, or transparency? And how big are you printing and what are you printing on? And then you just work yourself backwards from there. And you'll be able to figure out how much resolution you realistically need in order to get to the endpoint that you're looking for. I would say that the Imacon in the first scan that I did really got everything out of this 4x5 negative. Maybe I could go a little higher, but nothing over a gigabyte would really be necessary. And at that point, modern interpolation software, stuff like Topaz, different people's products, are so good that I could do 2, 4, 8, upsampling from there and get a much bigger image without having the need for that higher resolution scanner. The most important takeaway from this little section here is it's about the quality of the scan. So I would rather have a high quality, slightly lower resolution scan and upsample than have a really crappy high resolution scan. Now the Fuji, on the other hand, produces a really beautiful, very clean file. Once again, this was at ISO 80, and it would be very easy using any of the interpolation softwares that I mentioned to upsample that file as large as you could ever possibly want or need.
Okay, so which one did you prefer? Was it the digital or was it the film, and why? Please post it in the comments. Let's get a conversation started here. My opinion is that I still prefer the look of the film, but only so very little. And I'm gonna make a bold statement. And I've been waiting 20 years to make this statement, that I would use this digital camera without reservation for any shoot. If I had a shoot that was on a tight budget, if I had a shoot that had a tight timeline, and I couldn't use my beloved film, I would use this camera without reservation. It is really that good. Thank you very much for listening. I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Now go shoot some film.